Alright, in the next part, let's dive into a fundamental concept every developer needs to master: data fetching. So, data fetching is the way how we get the data that our apps rely on, either from APIs, databases, or other services. In Next.js, we have two ways to fetch this data: client-side fetching using hooks like useState and useEffect, and server-side fetching either at build time getStaticProps or on each request getServerSideProps. But why should we care about which method to use? So let's first talk about client-side fetching. This approach means your browser fetches the data after the page loads. Well, it's indeed straightforward to implement using React hooks like useState and useEffect like this, but it has some drawbacks. First of all, we have some delayed content display where user experience like a delay or like a loading spinner while waiting for the data to fetch to complete. This can make the site feel slow, especially on slower connections. And we also happen to have SEO problems, like the search engines might crawl your page before even the data is being fetched, which leads to poor indexing, and also security risk in which our API calls might get exposed. So this is where server-side fetching comes to the rescue. Let's break down why fetching data on the server is often a better choice. So first of all, we have faster user experience, which the server fetches the data before sending the HTML to the browser. When the user land on your page, they're able to see a fully loaded content and no waiting for API calls. And also we can also find it is SEO friendly. Since the data is fetched on the server, search engine bots can crawl the fully rendered page. This dramatically improves your site's discoverability. And also, it has a better or a secure API calls in which server-side fetching keeps API credentials and sensitive operations hidden from users since everything happens in the backend. Now let's look at how to implement server-side fetching in Next.js. So previously in the older versions of Next.js, we used to be using getStaticProps or getServerSideProps in order to fetch data on the server. But in the newer versions of the Next.js, all you have to do, you just need to use this one function called fetch. And with this fetch function, we are able to input that particular endpoint that provides the data, and it will be able to retrieve the data. So this happens because by default, Next.js would be running and rendering its component on the server. So all you have to do, we just need to make sure to call fetch function in order to get data from an external API. So that's how in the newer versions of the Next.js is built. Now let's implement this particular fetch function in our code. So in this code, I'm going to walk you through on how to fetch data on this server. So as you can see right here, we happen to have a simple code right here, which will render this particular code right here. And it's just a simple hello world text right here. And what we're going to do right now is going to make use of this particular API right here. This is a free API where it just provides us a list of users with their names and other data as well. This is just dummy users data. And this is endpoint that we'll be making use of to render a list of this particular API data and render that particular data into our project right here. So let's head back to our project right here. So as you can see, first of all, let's actually initialize that particular API. And of course, we must make sure to not to make use of any of the React hooks because those React hooks are client-side fetching functions. So in this case, we're going to be making use of fetch. So fetch is a function that we are able to use to fetch the data that is coming from a particular API. And for your info, Next.js by default renders its page on the server. So you don't need to specify getServerSideProps every single time when you would like to fetch data in Next.js. So first of all, we can just skip the getServerSideProps functions, and instead of we can just directly implement this particular fetch function right here. In this case, we can just make use of fetch. And this particular fetch function, of course, we'll be placing this particular API endpoint, which is right here. Just copy this endpoint and we'll be placing it within here. And of course, we need to store this particular fetch into a data. In this case, I'll have to call constant users. And since it's an API, of course, we must make use of await. And of course, await would be having async. So we need to make sure to use async right here. And with this, we are able to get all the list of users, but we must make sure to convert the data that we have fetched directly from this API right here. We're going to be making use of JSON. So in this case, I'll have to call users, but in this case, I'll have to change this. The old one should be response right here, because usually the data that you fetch directly from an API would be a response. And then next thing we need to do is convert to a JSON format. In this case, I'll have to say response.json. So it's a function right here. So what does it do is that it just converts this particular format that we received here in a raw format. We'll need to convert it to JSON, and then we're able to make use of the data that we have just fetched. Now with this users data right here, I would like to just make a list of users. In this case, I could make a list of repeating users, and that every user is going to be, of course, we need to make use of this map function right here. Within this map function, I like to have that particular parameter user. So user is what we will be using as an object to render every single data. So in this case, it's going to be an arrow function. And in this case, I like to have a bracket inside here. And within this bracket, I like to have li, which is the list right here. And I like to render every single user. And of course, let's see what data can we use from this API. As you can see, we can use this name right here. As you can see, let's put dot name. Okay. And as you can see, there's some issue with this code right here. Of course, we need to make sure to wrap everything within one clause right here. In this case, I have to take everything and just wrap everything within one clause right here, so that it'll be rendering only one clause. And there you go. And also, we must also make sure to add this particular await for this users as well. And so that you'll be able to have this particular issue fixed. And there you go. Right now, we're able to see a list of users to be listed in this Next.js front end right here. So this is how a simple way to fetch data via server. So as you can see, when I just hit refresh, you won't be seeing any loading or any buffering of the data, because the moment when the page loads, the data is already being fetched. So the data is being fetched first, and then the other content of the page or other elements, components of the page will be loading later. And that's how server-side rendering works. So basically, it just gets the data from all the APIs, and then the rest of the things happens next. So as you can see, this is how we are able to implement getting data from an API via server. Now next, let's look at when exactly client-side fetching is necessary. Now, I'm not saying client-side fetching is obsolete, but it is sometimes great for certain features such as lazy loading. So what does lazy loading means is that loading additional data only when the users interact or when they request for a new data. So in that way, all you have to do, just need to make sure to fetch a particular data that the user requests only when they wanted to see. Otherwise, we don't need to call that particular data. And that's what lazy loading even means. And also real-time updates. So think like a chat application or live stock tickers. So those things needs to get updates every single second. The data that is being retrieved needs to be updated every single time. So that's where client-side fetching is necessary. And besides these two, for most scenarios, especially like content-heavy or SEO-sensitive pages, then server-side fetching is the way to go. And finally, that's a quick look at why server-side fetching is often better than client-side fetching in Next.js. It's all about delivering a faster, smoother, or more secure user experience.